Why don't we get started with Committee of the Whole for the evening of Thursday, April 28th. I'll start with a motion to approve the minutes of our meeting held this past Monday. Second. Motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? That motion passes. And with that, going a little out of order here from what we would normally do, I would like to start with any public commenters that have already signed in so that we can get enough time to get questions answered and things of that sort. I imagine we may have more at the end as well, and that's okay because we only have one public commenter signed up at this time, and that person is Jesse Shedden.
Jesse Shedden, 1488 Marlowe. I just had two main concerns after listening to all the conversation the last few weeks, and it's really about traffic and parking. And while being very sympathetic to things like increasing tax revenue and wanting to drive economic development downtown, also look on the other side is the tax revenue, and that doesn't solve everything. And density being good, but not if it makes it harder to live in the city. My main concern is really just exactly that, the traffic and the parking when there's 200 plus apartment units going in on that corner to a spot where there's already potentially parking and traffic issues, and there were when the hospital was there with a lot fewer people at that point. So I really like what's planned down, what's actually up on the screen right now, down on Detroit, like call it that little U shape there with the plaza, but wondering if the city and developers have looked into the feasibility of having that, but then behind it more townhome style where you can put the parking behind. I know in the old plan there was some that had garages underneath, and looking at that type of solution to not overwhelm the corner with people. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Shedden, it occurs to me it may have been your children that I was quoting at one of our recent meetings about a playground on the plaza. Is that accurate?
It was.
Yeah, good. We appreciate their input as well as yours. So with that, Director Leininger, perhaps you could summarize for us, at the very least, what our timeline and process is going forward as a council, as a city, so that we can at least understand that as we go forward with our deliberations this evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. 1 second while here I pull up another slide from our original presentation back on, I think it was April 4th. So before I jump into this slide, let me just go back to what we said at the last meeting. I think we opened and we closed with this. This is the term sheet. This is the point of beginning for the development review process. This is really what this term sheet does, is it sets some guardrails, sets some markers out there for how we proceed forward with our negotiation for a development agreement and for a development plan. And by development plan, I mean the property is zoned plan development. It was rezoned as plan development as part of the previous application, previous proposal. That plan has since expired, and so we have to put a new plan in place. That planning process runs through both our Planning Commission and our Architectural Board of Review. Concurrent with that, there will be a development agreement negotiation that will be based largely on that development plan as that works its way through its process. The process then that's moving forward, once and assuming council grants the authorization to move forward with negotiation of that development agreement, that plan development process then is laid out here on the screen for you. Again, it starts with the preliminary development plan. Our goal would be to kick that off here in May with a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Architectural Board of Review. That would then proceed back and forth however many times is necessary with our Planning Commission, our ABR, with individual meetings, with neighborhood meetings mixed in as well. That would then culminate in basically a preliminary development plan approval. That is a very high-level plan, not unlike what we're looking at right now as part of the term sheet, or what you're seeing is submitted as exhibits for the term sheet. That then forms the basis for the final development plan and forms the basis for that development agreement. So concurrently, we'll be working through a development agreement process that would then come back to City Council along with the final development plan. We would kick that off with the end of the preliminary development plan. And again, these are estimated dates based on what we think it would take with the developer submitting good quality applications that are responsive to the comments of the Planning Commission and the ABR. And spend the next several months, August through probably the end of the year, working with the developer on our boards and commission approvals. The development agreement and development plan would then be brought back for City Council for an up or down vote. You have the authority on both of those documents. From there, we move into construction with a goal to start construction as soon as possible in 2023. Ultimately, with what you heard, the phasing with the developer being with Roundstone first, most likely the Curtis Block along with that, and the parking garage and the public plaza sandwiched in as that first phase, and then working their way, I believe they said clockwise around the site, down Marlowe and back up around Bell to wrap the site out. So that's the process. That's kind of where we are. If there's questions on that, I'm happy to answer them. Also this evening, I have all the information that was shared with you over the last several weeks. I can pull that up. We can go through that in any level of detail you'd like to see. If it's a refresher, so be it. I also yesterday provided you a response to the written questions that we received. So you should have that in your email. I can also pull that up as well and have that available if there's any follow-up questions on that information. But with that, I'm happy to go whichever direction you'd like us to go this evening.
Thank you. I did ask our council assistant clerk, Mr. Nick Lasky, to pull up some high-level buckets, if you will, areas for us to perhaps consider what council's priorities are in all of these different areas. A lot of this comes from the term sheet, but also other items or areas, if you will, that have been discussed by members of council throughout this process. I'm open to all kinds of ways to do this. I should note that I don't know that we have to have council's priorities hammered out perfectly by the 2nd of May necessarily, but we could give that a good shot this evening to do what we can to get some at least high-level priorities as a group on this document, and then we decide from there what we want to set as our priorities as a council. But for me, anyway, this evening, my hope was to work toward a comprehensive listing of what we as a council wanted to see in this development. Yeah, why don't we pull this up so we can see as much of it as possible, as much of the different bullet points as possible. Well done. And I'll begin just with one very, very simple piece for me that is important in this, and I've kind of heard it as possible and kind of heard it not possible as we've been discussing things. Very simply, just want to have built into this in the overall site the ability to expand where possible should market conditions change. I understand we're looking at a 4-story office building, I think a 3-story for the most part, 2 to 3-story residential. The Curtis Block is what it is, and I would love to see the ability for expansion if things change. I understand where office space needs are now. I understand where residential needs are now, and we're in a unique time in a post-COVID-ish world where things could change rather quickly and dramatically to where we could do more. As my colleagues and others have stated, the desire for as much density as possible here is important. With that, do any of my other colleagues have comments on any specific area shown here, or perhaps otherwise if I've missed something? Councilman Rader.
I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I'd love to dig into the sustainability environmental obligations section here, if that's, unless you want to work through this point by point.
No, that's okay.
Great. I'd sent around a document that had been pulled together by a couple different groups, including Power for Clean Future Ohio. We're a Power Clean Future Ohio city. It's a group, it's a nonprofit. They help just cities think through some of these things. And they looked at the term sheet, looked at the program, and we talked about it. And there's a couple of things that they were very happy about. The fact that we have a sustainability section at all, I think, was great. Kind of set some high-level sort of priorities and our vision for the project. But I'm wondering, Mr. Leininger, if what was discussed around like base minimums for energy efficiency, there's several standards that could be sought for some of the commercial buildings or even all the buildings on some level, and how that's sort of envisioned to be worked in. I know you'd mentioned very, again, top level in that sustainability section, there's some thought about it. My thought is that at least council, we should set some base minimum, sort of like we would like to see at least Energy Star certified, but there's a couple other levels above that, including LEED certification, which is much tougher, much more expensive, as a bare minimum to sort of match some of what we're doing with our climate action planning and just our goals as a city to be more efficient in energy and conscious about how we're using energy. So I just want to get a sense of where that conversation is headed, what are some of the things we're shooting for in the agreement, and what are some of the barriers, perhaps.
So, Councilman Rader, to your point, the questions or the discussion at this level has been largely around that sustainability, incorporation of sustainability measures, resiliency measures are important to the city, and we need to work through and understand how they can be incorporated into the site, whether it's in the site itself, whether it's in the building design itself. We spent time talking a little bit about their other projects, primarily the Dexter, because that's one that's nearby. Most of you, including city staff, have had an opportunity to go and tour. There were a number of measures that were included in that building. I believe that building is actually a LEED Gold certified.
Good.
We have talked about different certification programs that are out there. As you noted, there is a cost associated with those. And so there has been some discussion about whether or not we actually obtain that certification or we simply meet the goals that are prescribed within that certification. So we can take the money that's invested in just getting the certification itself into the building. But it has been at a very high level, looking at different programs that are out there. Some of the building types that are being proposed in this development are not buildings that have been built or they're not currently in Casto's pro forma or portfolio. So we'll have to work through, and they'll have to understand too, as they're building these basically custom buildings, how do we incorporate those elements in there? But we've had conversations about recycling programs as a result of the discussion that's taken place in these meetings. They'll obviously be included. EV charging stations will absolutely be included. That's going to be a demand it's already a demand on their marketplace. But even though the EV charging footprint is very small in the overall vehicles and in the roadway, they are seeing more and more need for that. So thinking through that, bikes, other things, we talked about ride share, then through the energy efficiency options that might be available in the buildings, and so forth. But it's been at a very high level at this point.
Okay. And then basically the only other thing that I had as a potential like amendment or something we could add potentially to our list was just finer detail, solar ready, making a minimum sort of requirement for that. You know, I understand that sometimes, especially when you get, the taller you go with buildings, the harder it is to do rooftop solar for obvious reasons, density reasons. It makes less and less sense as you start building units on top of each other. But making it so that it could be, at the very least someday, and kind of setting that as a goal or priority, especially since we're taking on this initiative to do the Soul Smart program and trying to make it easier for people to go solar generally, I think makes a lot of sense. It's about all I had. Member Keppel, did you have any other thoughts along these lines? I really appreciate your bringing this up last meeting in support of this. I'm sorry, Mr. President.
No problem. Councilmember Keppel.
Thank you, and thank you, Councilmember Rader, for pulling that sheet together with those resources. I had just, when I was looking through this, I saw the sustainability listed, and I know it was very high level. I was just thinking in terms of some of the green spaces, potential for, and looking at, it does mention it in the term sheet about being in alignment with our community vision and community wellness goals. So I was looking at that document, and that mentioned year-round green space and urban agriculture, And I thought, this could be a real opportunity to showcase some responsible, sustainable landscaping, show our values right downtown. So thinking things like wildflowers, pollinator supporting wildlife instead of grass, and potentially community gardens or plots for residents, other types of treatments like that, bioswales. But some of those things are mentioned, and I know as things move forward, I'm sure that'll come up in Planning Commission and ABR, but just putting a pin in that. And it is and it does say in line with community vision and wellness. I'm sure those will be referenced.
Mr. Chair. Councilman Bullock.
Thanks. I've got process questions, and I know, Director Leininger, we've had some informal consultation on this, but taking this sustainability sphere of work as a good working example, we're talking about concepts at a high level, and then we're saying, well, we don't know yet, and there'll be some future date. But please walk through in your mind's eye how that plays out. The thrust of what I'm getting at, though, is that meaningful action on any point, including sustainability, costs budget. And there's been a theme I've heard that the budget is limited. So therefore, unless it's already baked into what the developer envisions or the city's so far required, it may not happen. And so today we're talking about potentially exploring adding quality to the project in a bunch of different areas. Sustainability is first at the bat. But just as an example, I'm of the mind, as we've discussed and we've said in a couple of council hearings, that city council, when it acts, ought to enumerate priorities, goals. Some things might be conditional, such as exploring whether 75 parking spaces could be moved. We won't know the answer to that anytime soon. Other things could be clear, like we know we want strong public access defined for the public plaza. But the time for us to confirm those priorities is now, as opposed to, is the way I've been thinking about our process, as opposed to, well, we'll find out in July or October, even though we know that there's a vote, according to the timeline on the previous slide. There's 2 council votes coming in potentially in December. But as we've discussed, with something so complicated, so work intensive, and there's cost in drawing up legal documents and blueprints and architectural designs, it's better to do it earlier than later, because if you're going to get a change into the project, we got to do it up front, or we've got to know what we're aiming for as soon as possible, right? So for example, what Councilman Rader just proposed is, can we aim for construction at lead level or near lead level, regardless of whether we get the certification? But that costs money, and we need to know now if that's currently in the plans, because it won't work for us to say in October, hey, can we add that? See what I'm saying? So I know that you seem to have some level of confidence that we'll have space and time to work through a bunch of these important questions down the line. How does that work, and how does council have eyes on that and some joint authorship of some of these important questions?
So how that gets worked out from here, which is very much a concept, to the details of what is, when we talk about sustainability, let's just use LEED as this is standard, because that's what we've been mentioned a couple of times. The details of that get worked out through the next step in the process, which is through development review. That is when we start to now put some details and some granularity into what the overall development is. And this term sheet lays out what our priorities are from a very high level. And we have flexibility in all of those. A lot of these things that are in here, there's flexibility built into them. If council feels strongly enough that we need to reach a LEED, I'll just use gold as the example. If we say we have to reach LEED gold, that of course is going, there's only so much capacity in the project, and so that then, yes, that it will influence other things in the project. What will that influence right now? I don't know. But it's part of that iterative process where we have to go through Planning Commission ABR to start to develop those details. Council's involvement on that, as we've talked in some previous meetings, is one, be involved in that process, even though you're not at the table making the decisions at that point. Those recommendations will be coming back to you for a decision, so be involved. And then also, we keep you involved, bless you. We keep you involved just as much as we are our boards and commissions through committee of the whole meetings or whatever council decides for that touch point to be, to make sure that your finger's still on it as it's going through. And then we have to work as a staff to find that balance between what council's desiring versus what our boards and commissions are desiring. It's a delicate balance, but it's just part of the process where we just go through and we're taking bites at the apple as we get deeper into it, and eventually we come back with a plan for you that incorporates all of these things. So if you want more specificity in the sustainability section, we tried to lay out some very general concepts of what we're talking about. I think this is very, this language was included, or part of this language, I believe, was included in the previous term sheet and previous development agreement. So this isn't foreign language to council or to the city. We've used this before on the past site, and you saw kind of how that came to materialize through that project. But if there's something different you want to change here, you want us to focus on a certain thing, then we need to understand what it is you want us to focus on. But please let us do that with flexibility to come back to you along the way to show you how that impacts the plan overall.
Thank you, Director. Councilman Schechter.
Thank you. So I understand that we're going to be asked to approve the term sheet, which is essentially just allowing the administration, the mayor, or staff to start negotiations based on those terms. And at this stage, I'm no expert in development or engineering. There are members of this council that have a lot more knowledge about this thing, and I rely on them for that. I also rely on what Casto tells us. I rely on what the administration tells us. I don't have an independent expert to go out and look at every little thing and double check. I have faith that the administration is doing that. I only know what Casto is telling us. I only know what's possible by what Casto is telling us is possible, and what my colleagues and the administration believe is in the best interest of the city and where there is room to move. So I see it as my position here is to work as hard as I can and ask the questions, which I believe all my colleagues have been doing throughout this month-long process to ensure that this is the best product possible for Lakewood. I know that our Planning Commission and Architectural Board of Review does have, it's packed with experts. Every time I go to one of their meetings, I'm impressed by the questions they ask, the input they provide, that it's relevant, and more often than not improves projects and instead of just delays. And what I want to avoid, and I'm interested in what their view is once this process started. I'm going to go to those meetings. I'm interested how the Planning Commission is going to view this and Architectural Board Review, and at the community meetings, what the public is informed. We have been informing them throughout this. I know I have. But once the project is fully, officially in meetings where people are, again, invited to comment, I'm excited to hear what they have to say. What I don't want to see happen is there's that saying that a camel was a horse formed in committee. I don't want to put very specific markers down on how we want something done, as I don't believe and I could be wrong. I'm certainly not an expert on design or engineering. And to not, and again, to do another Rumsfeld type quote is like, I don't know what I don't know on some things. And I'm excited to learn even more as this process continues. With that being said, I think from the very beginning, my number one priority, and has been my priority since being on council, is to provide space for more people to live in this city. It's an interesting thing that cities are unique in. You hear all the time about, the United States, we want people to come in and move. We want their expertise. We want what they bring to the table. The state of Ohio is putting up ads in California trying to convince people to move here. Sometimes cities seems like the one place where we want to keep everybody out. And I understand the political incentives to do that because the people who are voting for you already live here. But I don't believe in excluding people from what Lakewood has to offer in our schools and our resources, and quite frankly, the people that do live here and enjoy Lakewood. And I would love to welcome more people here, and I think that it's evident that people want to be here by how quickly houses get snatched up and how few of them go on the market. And I like that because of the way this is being done with the planned development and working in partnership, in a sense, that we have control. I mean, the city could just sell the land, and as long as it fits the zoning regulations, the owner could build whatever the heck they want on it. This process allows us, if the almost as a partnership, as if the developer needs certain things to make some financials work, we get something in return. That's use of that space, which we have to lock down and make sure that is going to be a true partnership in how that public space is used, public-private partnership. And with the affordable housing component. And I understand the arguments that people make about, oh, is that truly affordable housing? But as I made in past committee meetings that involved the community reinvestment area, TIF, the thing about affordable housing is expensive. And what does true affordable housing look like? It looks like towering buildings with tons of unit at most efficient cost with incredible city subsidy. So in this sense, I'm excited to see units that are more affordable than market rate. I guess that's a more accurate way to put it, which allows people who are getting their start in Lakewood, or that want the option to start off living in our community, start building a family here, start building life here, do. So that's a long way of me saying that what I'm most interested in seeing is, of course, residential density. And I'm interested in, that's my marker, really. Not so much as what it looks like, where it is. That's what drives me the most. So, thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Councilman Schechter. I share in a lot of them, actually. But actually, sorry, Councilmember Keppel, go ahead.
Your prerogative, the chair. So thank you, Councilmember Schachner. I just, in thinking about how we organize ourselves this evening, I was thinking very much in terms of, thank you, with this list of just less than necessarily, I guess I don't think so much in specific buckets. This is partly, I think, my educational background, I think, in terms of outcomes and priorities and working backwards to reach them. And so for me, and that's actually how I sent in my questions to Director Langer, that we had outcomes at the bottom. And following Councilmember Schachner's comments, I think for me it would be, if we wanted, and I don't know if, Nick, are you keeping track? Oh, you are, okay. All right, so if whoever is scribing these ideas, if we can get a copy of that. But, so anyway, so for me, I think I would share that is particularly, so I think in one of our meetings, we learned that federally, we're only required to do about 2% of the overall project as accessible or universal design. I'd like to see that number go up quite a bit. We, in Lakewood, I don't know, but I would doubt that 2% of our current housing stock is accessible. I hear all the time about people with disabilities, whether that's seniors or other people with disabilities. And, you know, most of our housing stock in Lakewood is, of course, multi-story, older, expensive to adapt. So I feel like we could, this is an opportunity, again, to Councilman Schachner's point of when we are investing in the community, this is something that our community can get out of this space for sure, is more accessible housing for people who, you know, folks aging in place and other people with disabilities. And along those lines, so I guess if I were going to frame that as an outcome statement, I would like to see affordable and accessible housing be a significant part of the project to allow families, people with disabilities, and seniors to remain in Lakewood. And that would also include, with the families aspect, we talked about the 3-bedroom also. So we learned from the school district when we had our joint meeting, we're losing a lot of families who can't necessarily stay here anymore. We have families move here, refugee families. We want them to be able to stay longer. So more opportunities for affordable family housing. So those would be probably two of my largest priorities. And as an outcome, whether that means the 2 private homes are moved and changed to condos, whether the townhomes are restructured to be 1-floor or flat development, however that works, I don't think it's our job, as Councilman Schachner said, to be prescriptive in the methods, but more giving voice to our priorities in terms of what we want to accomplish, not necessarily how we want it accomplished. Although I will be excited if there is an ice rink. I'm just putting it out there. But so, and then also in terms of the community space, and we talked about this, and I was very encouraged to hear the developers say that they view the community space as predominantly a public space for the whole community. That's a big emphasis for me. What most members of our community will get out of this space is not living there. They may or may not shop there, but what everyone in our community can get out of this space is that public space where we can have public events, and I really want to see that be a main emphasis for sure. So those are 2 of my big outcomes that I'm looking for, and I'll turn it over to others to add.
Thank you, Councilmember Keppel. I know, Councilman Rader, you had some comments. I did want to just simply ask what the feasibility of, what's the general guesstimate of a cost for an elevator in some of these buildings? It occurs to me that if not every building having an elevator, the most densely populated one, perhaps having one, could add some accessibility very quickly onto the site.
So I'm trying to get to a site plan, which I don't know if I have one open. Yeah, there's one in the corner here. Well, actually, this is a good one. So any building that's more than 3 stories is required by code to have an elevator. So for sure, the buildings that are part of the Curtis block, and then I'll go up here to a site plan. Bear with me, I'm trying to zoom in so I can see. So this is the Detroit, Marlowe, Curtis block building attached to it. This building will, of course, have an elevator because this is a 5-story building. The elevator was proposed in this corner as a central lobby. This is a 4-story building, so this building will have a elevator as well in this corner to create that central residential gateway into the project or into the development. These buildings, the way they're currently designed, as Councilperson Keppel mentioned, these are the way these are designed, there's not currently an elevator plan for them. However, that's something that we've taken note of about how do we potentially look at these for increased density? How do we look at this building as potentially an opportunity to increase residential density on the site along with the single-family homes? But these two buildings represent most of the units in the project, so most will have access to an elevator. But as part of our conversation, we can continue to examine opportunities on these southern portions.
So just ballparking it here, we're looking at well over 50%, perhaps 75% of the units being accessible via an elevator and proper ramps and those sorts of things.
And if you give me a minute, I can tell you the exact number. I just got to get to a different slide.
We have all the time we need, so don't feel like you have to do that right this moment.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
And that's a very good point. I just wanted to, and Director Leininger, I've talked about this, so I know he's aware, but, so the elevator is one part of that. And then the other piece, of course, I've learned more than I've learned quite a bit working with the ADA Task Force that the elevator piece would be one aspect, but of course, things like having, you know, the shower without, you know, these sorts of things. There's a whole component of having universal design within the space itself. And while some of them may be designed, or all of them may be designed to be convertible, that can be an additional expense for people with disabilities. And so, and often there's a financial burden there too. So looking to you know, intentionally design as much of this as possible for folks. And then also, if there's opportunities for ownership within that, just because, you know, we've talked about that too, about more opportunities for ownership. So whether that's a more condo method or however that looks, that's not my expertise. I just know what I want to be able to tell our community we're providing more accessible housing. So, and that, for that to be true.
And so, Mr. Chair,
Thank you. Yes.
This chart actually shows 80 units are in the, for lack of the Curtis Block building, 76 units are in the building behind that. So that's 156 of the 204 units. So that's 76, almost 77% of the units have access to an elevator as currently planned. So, but with the comments considered, we can look to increase that.
Okay, and the elevator, imagining that 76% is sufficient from council's perspective, I don't know if it is or it isn't, but would some of the other points that Councilmember Keppel made be automatic in the design anyway, or would those be add-ons?
So as far as the accessibility features of the building, or of the individual units, and so if I recall correctly from our conversation, automatically 2% of the units must be ready-made, accessible with the grab rails, with everything. All the other units have to be able to be accommodated based on the building code. So they still have to be able to they won't necessarily have the grab bars and the hand bars and the other things in the unit, but the ability is there for them to be added in the future. So generally, and I'm not a building code expert, but generally I do believe many of those other things are obtainable and reachable if they're not already automatic.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to Councilman Rader, one question that doesn't need an answer now, but I'd like to hear an opinion or a thought by the end of the meeting is on the affordable housing side. Switching gears, sorry. Is it contemplated to intermingle affordable units or to confine them to one space and thus sort of institutionalizing NIMBYism in this project?
Part of our rules for affordable housing require them not only to be intermingled, but they also have to be spread across all the different unit types. And so they can't just all be the studio units that are within the project. They have to be spread generally proportionally through the studios, the 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and then we're talking about 3 bedrooms into a 3-bedroom unit as well. So.
I appreciate the 0.1 second answer time on that. You didn't have to do that. All right, sorry. Councilman Rader, you've been patient.
That was exactly my question, and asked probably much more concisely than I would have ever. So thank you, and thank you for the concise answer. But I will second and why wouldn't we shoot for 100% accessible? Is that unrealistic? In terms of at least having an elevator, maybe not every single universal, is that just like pie in the sky, no way on earth you'll ever get to every unit being accessible for somebody who doesn't, you know, who has to have some kind of aid to get to the,
One of the things that we had set out, we were trying to provide different unit types. So in providing different unit types, you may have some multi-level living, and so that then precludes the being able to accessible from floor to floor.
Got
Certainly, it's possible, but the sacrifice may be the variety of unit types that we're offering
I see.
through the entire project. So
so that provides some clarity. Thank you. Thank you, Member Kappel, for bringing up that very important point.
Councilman Bullock, and then Councilmember Keppel, if you had.
I was going to take us in a new direction, so if you wanted to.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just following up on that is, in terms of different unit types, I would suggest, which I appreciate that point, but that we could still have different unit types that are potentially opportunities for ownership for people with disabilities. So still different unit types, all those sorts of things. So just making that point. But I appreciate it, and I appreciate the continued conversation about that.
Thank you. Councilman Bullock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A couple of miscellaneous things to respond to. To Mr. Sheldon? Shedden, sorry, I can't read the handwriting. I agree that traffic is an important concern. I think we can be successful in managing that. The project is proposed with ample-sized parking garage envisioned. I know that traffic management is a major focus for the Planning Commission. Historically, they've done a very strong job of that. So I'm optimistic that we wouldn't experience excessive problems in terms of parking capacity. Traffic safety is a very good thing to call out, and a number of us have noticed recently, because we're parents of small kids, that there have been accidents, some serious and sometimes fatal accidents, not in our community, but in the region. And so, you know, I'd certainly want to flag that as important. I think council isn't the only body that would think that, but nevertheless, it may be appropriate for council to include among our other expectations that how the plan fits. Yeah, it's called out here, you know. So if this is sufficient language, then great. If not, you know, we can consider adding to that for things such as traffic signalization, pedestrian crossings, all that kind of stuff. Let me, to my colleagues, so I think we do want to be detailed and specific enough in the priorities that we enumerate so that we're successful in achieving them. I've heard that, you know, we don't want to micromanage, that's true, but we do need to be detailed. So we can say certain things are priority, but if there's not enough detail, then that may not be actionable. And by being specific, we don't ask anybody to read our minds, and we minimize the risk of miscommunication. And with a project this big and complex, with so many moving parts, I think that's important to do. So for example, I certainly support sustainability, residential density. In fact, I like office density just as much, although I think I understand that you know, is a point to be conceded, but residential density, I think we could work to try to achieve. More accessibility, that for sure is something that we should be doing. More affordability, we might be at the maximum at the moment, but if that's something that we can further improve, let's do it. How do we enumerate that so we're successful? Because if we just say, in general terms, these things are important, that's one thing, but it's better if we say, we specifically want to increase the percentage from 2% to 10% for accessibility. That drives the conversation so that we can get detailed cost estimates from our development partner, and then we can actually analyze whether that's feasible, it's excessive, or maybe it's in between. We could maybe achieve that if we found resources from a source. So I think it's not only appropriate, but it's constructive for council to be detailed, because that's our job. I mean, we're here to set policy, we're here to set priorities, and in this case, we're here to safeguard the public interest in a major development, major in every sense, major because it's in our downtown, major because it's a big piece of land, and major because there's huge financial implications to build it, to operate it, and to, we hope, gain financially over the years. I guess a question to ourselves, really, and to the chair, but really to all council members is, what's our work product that we're aiming towards? I hope, have we agreed, I just guess want to pose a question, have we agreed that we're going to enumerate a list of whatever is on that list in whatever form it takes? It could be a council term sheet, it could be a report or a letter similar to what the citizen advisory group provided. It could be a resolution. I think those all would be equally effective, and I don't have a preference in terms of the format, but what I do think would be constructive is that we would go through the exercise of asking ourselves, where do we have consensus to support these things, and then put that in so that at the beginning of the process, all of our partners, administration, the developer, the public, planning commission, ABR, and whoever else I'm forgetting, Public Arts Task Force, Sustainability Task Force, all have clarity, right? And some things, for example, like exploring whether the 75 parking spaces can find a home somewhere else, that's not within the purview of the planning commission to try to do, or ABR, or somebody else. It would be the administration and council. So I guess that's how I'm thinking about it. Can I get some feedback from my colleagues that we should be working intensively in the next several days or week, if we need a week or two, to develop such a list, query ourselves, and then have that in clear form to accompany whatever vote we might take?
I'll make one quick comment. Thank you, Councilman. And that is, speaking to specificity, I mean, it occurs to me that we could say we want exactly 100% of the units to be accessible or something along that line. But I think we as a body are nuanced enough to understand that it might not be possible to do 100%, so we might want to say 90 to 100% or have a range and be at least somewhat general in terms of how we frame this so that we're not unrealistic in our expectations.
Yeah, if I can respond, I mean, that's a great point. What I would suggest we do is one or more of us begin drafting something, and let's say, for example, the first draft said we want 100% accessibility. I think, as you pointed out, Mr. Chair, there's enough reasonable minds in council, and certainly council asked for feedback from others, to understand that 100% may not be feasible, so we revise that before calling for a final vote on that point to a lower threshold that is reasonable. I mean, does that sound, but I don't necessarily know. Let's use an example that's less pronounced. So let's say we said, let's make sure 20% are fully accessible. I don't know, without digging in a little bit, if that's an attainable figure or not. And I kind of need to force the question by getting started with putting a number out there, is my suggestion. And I mean, I think that's essentially what our partners in the administration have been doing with Casto iteratively for a year or more. But why are we doing this? Because we're representing the public in a broader sense, I think.
Right, and I think I'm merely suggesting that we've been at this we've had the term sheet for a month or so, and we've had, this is our fourth meeting? Fifth, if you count the first reading. So really fourth meeting to really discuss it. But, several hours now of discussion. I'm not saying we don't need more. I'm merely saying that we know some things now that we didn't know a month ago, and so whatever we put forward ought to take into account the responses we've received from the developer, from the anchor tenant,
Certainly.
from the realtor, et cetera.
Certainly. It can and it should. It takes a lot of work, which is why, and I'll note that our very excellent meetings up to now have been briefing. It's been fact-finding. This is our first when we're attempting to pivot to try to develop city council opinions about what the priorities would be from our perspectives. And I can put stuff out there, but I'm one of a broader group, so then that's another layer we have to deal with. But for sure, we should be integrating and be realistic and constructive. There could be, though, areas of disagreement, right? And so Curtis Block may be one of those, although I hope that it's not a disagreement, rather it's more in terms of what's valuable, but in how we get there. And there could be some other points. So in those cases, council responding to what we've heard from our partners with a different answer might just be, we're expressing a policy choice or priority that is different than has taken place to date.
So, and then I think Councilman Schechter is next. I don't know if someone else had raised their hand.
I think Kyle said.
Yeah, I mean, on the, Mr. Chair, yeah, on the process point, I think, you know, and, right, I mean, legally, what's before us is, you know, consideration of a term sheet that's already been signed, right? So we're, the way I look at our job and the process, right, we're not the executive, we're the legislative, so we're going to give our opinion, right, of where it's going and an indication of, if this was the development agreement, would we like it, right? Would we approve it? Because that's ultimately what we're going to be asked to do, is to approve the development agreement. So I think that there is a way that, you know, taking the assistant clerk's, you know, notes tonight, you know, I've already offered to the chair to kind of shepherd with Councilperson Keppel, you know, a document. My kids are, oddly, for some reason, their school is closed tomorrow, so I will be taking the day off. And between them fighting over Hot Wheels, I will try to, you know, work with Councilperson Keppel to draft something. And the idea would be to circulate that and kind of try to come up with a consensus based on what we've heard, right? And then, you know, we can put it on the floor on Monday. I mean, I don't know process-wise exactly what we want to do. But essentially, you know, I see it as an addendum, you know, or similar to what the advisory panel, you know, their comments. And you know, I would, within that, I've struggled with this, right? And this is more process, not kind of what's in the term sheet. But I think we should consider whether or not we request, you know, of the administration that someone from council be the point person from now term sheet to development agreement. Just because you know, some of it's like how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And if you have more time, then you can take those bites, you know, and enjoy it a little more. So, not that you would enjoy eating an elephant, it's a bad analogy. Yeah. So that's one thing I think I'd be interested in. We haven't talked about that on the floor, right? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, or whether you think we're the legislative branch, so we should stay here, right? And then give a thumbs up or thumbs down. Also interested in the administration's thoughts on something like that from a process standpoint. I have more, you know, kind of issues I'd like to get into with the term sheet, but I'll wait till we kind of think about the process.
Certainly. I do feel like I would like council to have a seat at every table available to us where we possibly can. I do, it's part of why I asked if the advisory panel would be reconvened as part of this. Council had a seat at that table. And if that were to be the case, you know, perhaps that's another opportunity for council to be apprised of things as we go forward. I would expect that we would have a committee of the whole meeting or a council meeting agenda item at least monthly through the end of the year that would be addressing these topics. And if necessary, yes, executive session would need to be considered if there's nuances to the negotiations that ought not be in the public sphere, and only for that reason. So I think there's lots of ways for council to remain to be at the table. It's part of why I asked Director Leininger to summarize the whole process, start to finish, so we'd understand it. This isn't, you know, May 2nd is not the Alamo for this by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's a lot of room to continue discussion. And I do hope, even though it is sort of an arduous and time-consuming task, that council can come together on some specific, as detailed as we can be, priorities as a body, even though we are 6 or 7, depending on the day.
Mr. Chair, to build on that point, so yes, it's arduous. It's worth our time, though. This is an important issue. I mean, every issue that comes before us, it's a privilege to serve, right? And we've got 50,000 residents to be responsive to, 50 and a half or 52,000. So this is worth our effort. Yeah, and there's a middle ground. There's a common sense about the level of specificity. There's some sweet spot. I think it's in the interest of all of us to be communicating on a high and consistent basis, and I strongly support the idea of one or even two council members from the body, and soon we'll have a seventh, to be our kind of point or ongoing engagement people. It was observed to me by a resident recently that we had that with hospital negotiation in some of the final stage, the critical stage. The deal wouldn't have happened without some council member engagement. There were two council members that went. The other thing is that the timeline envisioned is very fast for construction, for plans, review, and construction. I think it's in everyone's interest, is what I'm driving at, to stay closely in communication, because that'll facilitate quality and speed at the same time.
John?
We do have a lot going on, that's for sure. Sorry, Councilman Shacker, you've been very patient.
Maybe.
You seem,
I
perhaps,
No, I would agree with being with specificity and being as detailed as possible. This was the end point. There are lots of veto points through this process. My opinion is that council should provide some guidance of what it would like to see, what it approves of, what it disapproves of in the term sheet, what it hopes to see in the future. If members want to do more specific asks and put their marker down for that, that could be done through a communication and also submitted. I think our deadline for this does not have to be May 2nd. It does not have to coincide with a passage of the authorization to begin negotiating. I would think that we would want to get this in prior to the first Planning Commission meeting, because I think that's where the rubber's going to hit the road on this, is if council's priorities with this project and opinions of this project are shared with the Planning Commission at the time that they start to hear this and deliberate. I think they are the ones, oddly enough, in this situation that have power to, and it's a good thing, quite frankly, because these are citizen-led commissions to look over. It's from our residents. And there's a lot of opportunities for public comment in those types of meetings. And at the end of the day, I mean, council isn't losing any leverage here by not putting a specific stake in the ground immediately on May 2nd or prior to passage of the resolution authorizing the administration to negotiate. At the end of the day, if we don't like what we see, we could reject the thing entirely. So there's incentive on the administration's part to make sure that council is on board with what is happening. Though some on council, well, of course, in reality, the administration only has to be ensure that the majority of council is on board. But with, I think, in some, that because there are many veto points along the road, that there are many opportunities to provide comment, that I think that a specific as the one that Mr. Bullock is advocating or desiring, don't have an opinion one way or the other, but I think general marks are good from council, what we like, what we don't like, and if certain members have particular asks, you could go through communications, and that should be communicated with the Planning Commission, who's going to have a lot of direct contact with the developer in the future.
very good.
Mr. President?
Mayor.
Sorry to
yes.
interrupt. I just want to make one clarifying statement, and I hope I I heard this right, but regarding planning commission timing, we obviously will miss the May planning commission scheduled meeting, but we obviously are ready to go on the administration's end. So we have planned a special planning commission meeting on May 17th, actually a joint meeting with ABR, assuming everything passes. So just to make sure that we're following a timeline and being timely. So I just want to make that clarification.
Is the 17th a Thursday? Tuesday? Okay. So it'd be after our second May meeting.
And we do need that time to, and Sean, you know the time about getting the details over to them as well.
Yeah, we have to advertise 1 week before, or generally we advertise 1 week before. We also send out notices to all the owner, to the surrounding properties.
Sure, with that stated, a placeholder agenda item on council's priorities could be included in the planning commission agenda for that meeting if by May 2nd we did not have our priorities fully enumerated.
Mr. Chair, a quick question on the planning commission process. So the 17th, the joint meeting of ABR and planning commission, is that to start the plan development process?
I'm sorry. what was-
So the joint meeting that you mentioned, is that to start the plan development process? Or
Start the preliminary development plan review process. The plan development is already in place. The plan development zoning is already in place.
But then you have to get a new one though, right? Because it's the old
We
site.
do, and
that's-
so that would kick off that process as a joint meeting, as an introductory meeting to both Planning Commission and ABR, to have that introduction about the process, what the roles are for everybody, and then give the developer an opportunity to just generally introduce their plan to both boards and commission, both the board and commission, to move forward then with their regular meetings in June.
So, okay, so as I understand it, does it matter because this property is technically under a planned development? So because it's under a planned development, does it not, explain that to me, because I know when it went from whatever zoning it was as the hospital, and it went into a planned development, I believe it started at council and then it went to planning commission, back to council for final approval.
Yep.
Because it's already in planned development, now does it just go to planning commission and then come back to council for final approval?
It does, and so we spent a lot of time with the law department. Jen Swallow, the Assistant Chief Law Director who represents or assists with the Planning Commission, going through the zoning code. And because this isn't a modification to the plan development, it's actually, the plan has expired. So the process goes right directly to the Planning Commission with a new preliminary development plan that will get vetted by both Planning Commission and ABR. And then, once they give their blessing on that, we do it again with a final development plan, and that final development plan is what comes back before the city council.
And that's setbacks, heights, densities, mixes of uses.
Yeah, preliminary development plan is generally that, and then the final development plan is all the details related to, okay, these are the materials, these are the plants, this is the colors and signs and everything else that goes along with it.
So you're technically going on the approval back in 2018 from council to start the plan development process because it expired.
Because, yeah, and the zoning's already there.
So you're just making the choice not to start it at council again because it already happened?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a choice, it's just,
Or that's just
with the code.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Good questions. I think, Councilmember Keppel, did you have something that I missed? Okay, then Councilman Rader.
Yeah, in terms of this council, I guess, priorities, is what we're calling it for this, I think that word sums it up well, as long as we've given the administration some of the ideas of what we prioritize, so in some form, and that they're specific enough where they can bring something back to us, and they'll kind of know. And if they can't achieve something, they're going to bring it back and tell us why, right? But I do really think it's super important we give them something very clear, having that clarity, so that there's no confusion in what we're expecting, right? I think we're all kind of saying the same thing then, right? To a higher degree or a lesser degree. And I think we're on the right path. And I don't think it should be too difficult. We're quite a ways down the path and really getting our thoughts and ideas out there. We've got a lot of great feedback from the administration, some of our questions, to have something together, if not by the May 2nd meeting, by the following meeting, right? I feel like we're pretty close, right? But that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Councilman Rader.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Keppel.
You wanted to speak before I did. How about that?
Sense it.
Well, so I guess I'll just speak for myself. I thought we were going through that priority process tonight, like, right, of just,
Here, yeah?
okay, right? I mean, I'm ready to state mine as, which, I mean, I sort of did with accessibility, and I'm willing to make that, you know, and to your point about, you know, again, going to sort of a logic model, outcome-based process, you would typically have your impact statement, then your outcomes that you desire, and then your measurable goals, right? And so, like, how do you know whether you've reached that outcome or not? So fair enough to say there could be some specificity about, like, using accessible as a marker, whether, to Councilman Rader's point, like, why wouldn't we go for 100%? And I don't know the answer to that. So, you know, we could say that's a goal, and then as it moves forward, and then all the numbers are crunched. But I think, you know, so yes, I'm agreeing with everyone. That was sort of my expectation, was that we were doing those priorities, going through that tonight as much as possible, talking amongst ourselves, seeing where we have consensus. It sounds like we do on this point with the accessibility. So we could write one down because we have one, right? We have that one, and then we can, I think, over the weekend, the next week, if we wanted to wordsmith, but if Councilman Baker and I want to kind of wordsmith, and then if we have a cow on Monday, we can come back with it listed, any last changes, then we've got at least that priority list, and if we wanted to do a more detailed report with any other specific comments, feedback, then that's fine, but I think that high-level list is what I was expecting to achieve tonight. Is that
Absolutely.
good?
I
Okay.
have no qualms about my colleagues and I throwing in specifics, and if you have a few more you would like to send our way,
Okay.
have at it.
Okay. So I think the other ones I had is making sure this isn't, I don't have this wordsmith yet for how I want it to read as an outcome, but the community space be primarily for the public, and consider in its design concepts, environmental design, both in gun violence prevention and sustainability. As we've been talking about that with some of our park spaces, unfortunately, gun violence is now the leading cause of death with children and teens, and is, you know, we've unfortunately experienced it some in our community. Hopefully we won't again ever, but just being prepared. And making sure it's predominantly public and designed to suit in consultation with our community partners and organizations. Oh, and then this is very specific, so I don't know if I want to make this a high-level one, but I guess maybe it goes to the high level of the sustainability level, and I don't know how I don't know if Councilman Rader or Bullock, you guys are sustainability guys, but have specific language about sustainability. It's already in the term sheet, but I did point out on the term sheet about the trees of having more than was previously there is not a high bar, and I think we can do better. So whatever that is, that's not a high-level priority, but that's just generally speaking that the landscaping is considered in a sustainable approach.
Thank you. And quick accessibility question to Director Leininger, or whoever might be best suited to answer this. Is the potential for any unit to be accessible enough for us to feel like we're at 100%? Meaning, if a unit is leased by someone who has some accessibility needs, if part of that lease stipulates that if there are those needs, they will be swiftly installed, is that getting at what we're hoping for in terms of the elevator accessible units being made fully accessible?
Yeah, I believe that flexibility gives us the room to accomplish what you're trying to do with 100% accessibility. So the bathrooms, the rooms, the toilet heights, it may not necessarily have the tub, as an example, may not be set up for accessibility, but can accommodate an accessible tub. So that's what I'm hearing is there's no constraint in the design of the building that would otherwise prohibit accessibility being incorporated into the unit. And then, of course, there was a previous comment about, I think the requirement is that 2% of those units already have all those features in it. I believe there was discussion of you'd like to see something more than that. So,
And I guess, yeah, to that point, for me, anyway, speaking for myself, but pursuant to Councilmember Keppel's hopes, you know, the ability to make any unit accessible would seem to be to accomplish what we're looking for. Are there other specifics from my colleagues that they'd like to point out, Councilman?
Yeah, just for Deputy Clerk Laskew's sake, I'll read off some of the things that I found to be, and we talked about already, but if you already have it, Mr. Laskew, feel free to skip it. But just ensuring that, I would say that the minimum, we'll be looking for when this comes back, a minimum of Energy Star rating on these buildings. If not, of course, we could have that discussion, and shooting for some type of LEED certification would be something we'll be searching for when that agreement comes back to us. On-site generation, we should just add solar ready being a minimum. And then there being a separate sort of dot there for sustainability that Mr. Keppel mentioned and Mr. Leininger mentioned for making space for separate waste recycling and compost management. Let's see if there's anything else here. You've mentioned EVs. I feel pretty confident that was outlined a couple times, a couple different places in the agreement. I'm not sure we need to hit on it again, but if Mr. Bullock feels that we need to include that, certainly defer to him on that. But those are the things I've written down, so thank you.
Thank you. Let's see here then.
Mr. Chair.
Councilman Bullock.
So if Councilwoman Keppel, did you work through your list of items? Okay. 'Cause I don't want to interrupt your flow. So I have a list of items which we didn't get to because my previous comments were process related, which is very helpful and needed. But if it's okay, I'll take a crack at a few things. And these are things you've heard me talk about before. I do want to make sure that well, this is newly stated, that I want to ensure that the financials, as advertised, we have assurances that they'll perform as advertised. And so that includes detailed contingencies if construction costs increase, if the timeline's delayed, not by the city, but by the developer. What if market projections don't perform as envisioned? You know, we should have the agreement worded to protect the taxpayers and the community financially. We should understand the scenarios and who pays, essentially. You know, and the developers, their job, they're a for-profit company to do a good project, but also to make sure it's financially pencils in and is profitable for them. It's our job, of course, to look after the community's interest. And, you know, we should also, I think, understand, this probably is not something we put in a term letter, but I just want to say it to my colleagues. We should understand what line is not, across which line a project would not be financially worth it to the community. If the return on investment costs are not sufficiently positive, you know, what's that marker when we would know then that the project should be modified or not pursued? So, and that probably would be something that we would deepen our understanding with the help of the administration. You know, it may involve some confidential financial discussion with our development partner. But to me, that's a minimum due diligence that we should have as we contemplate votes by the city council to essentially authorize the approach that the administration has laid out. You know, and Sean, maybe we'll postpone discussion for now. Let me keep rolling. Or
Yeah, I'm just not sure what the marker, I'm trying to
well,
figure out what the marker
I don't
is.
know what it is myself. What I'm saying is we should understand. We should have some sense, we collectively. And, you know, in this case, I don't know if council would have a different opinion than the administration at all, but as I reflect it, you know, how do we know when it's not worth it? Now, obviously, I think the intent of the project is not to propose something that comes that way. But if a number of unforeseen circumstances happened, we should understand that scenario, and so that we're protecting, at a minimum, we're protecting the taxpayer and the community in every sense, that the project as envisioned will perform as we hope and expect, and we have, you know, legal and financial protections accordingly.
So if I, Mr. Chair, if I could just expand on that. So we all will, every development agreement that we put together will have some of those protections in place. And so what I mean by that is it's going to set the minimum thresholds, and it's already laid out in the term sheet, actually, for what's going to be set up for office use, what's going to be set up for residential, what's going to be set up for commercial. It's going to have financial protections built into the development agreement through bonding assurances that they're able to, they've obtained the financing to be able to execute the project. It's going to then have timelines that they have to meet in order to complete the project. All of those things, if they don't provide those items, are considered defaults, meaning that if they don't meet those requirements, then they are in jeopardy of losing their TIF, their abatement, well, not the abatement, the TIF, and the overall development agreement starts to unravel. So we generally will bake those items in, and you'll see those baked into the development agreement as that comes back to you. It's just a level of specificity that we generally don't work to at this point. But you've seen it somewhat in the Solov development agreement. You've seen it in the Studio West development agreement.
Yes, understood. No, I appreciate that. And so in this case, it may be just a matter of further due diligence to understand what kind of is implicitly there, and maybe to explore some contingencies to be doubly sure. Do we still, I haven't had time to read the 11 pages that you shared with us this morning, but I certainly will do so, Mr. Leininger. Have we had an updated valuation of the land value?
So no, we have not updated, and in fact, there actually is an appraisal. There was an appraisal done previously on the property.
Recall the value of that previous?
In the previous scenario, I believe the appraisal was done on the current Cleveland Clinic Family Health Center property, and then it was extrapolated from that value, the value of the hospital site from that.
So we
So
don't.
the number is?
It was.
So the number was, it was between 5 and 6 million
Or the vacant parcel?
for the parcel as it was at that time before we discovered all the environmental and
Okay,
other.
and was that with the building on it or with the building cleared?
Just the land and the
The
curb
land,
wall.
I believe, yes.
Okay.
So no, but to the larger question, no, we have not updated that. There's some question about how do we update that. A lot of times, we generally don't necessarily do appraise, we do broker's opinion of value. And so that's something we can evaluate as we get deeper into the process. Because that's an open item that's in the term sheet currently is an open item with the land and how do we manage that land.
I'd
and
like-
transfer of it.
To that point, if it's okay, Councilman Bullock, I'd like to understand the value in knowing the value now, if it's going to be developed upon anyway, and then rightly tax assessed from there, I assume.
So right now, we've been using the auditor's appraised value of the property since they just recently went through an appraisal process, and that sits right around 1.5 million with the Curtis block included in that equation, as well as then they do put a value on the parking lot that's at the south end of the site. So with that, the entire site is currently valued at 1.5 million. Now, of course, the auditor, when they establish that, they don't necessarily are aware that there's environmental issues on the property that could suppress that value further. But at the end of the day, not having, we believe that's a fair value for our purposes right now.
That's the auditor's number, though. That's not the free market number, right?
Well, the auditor's number is generally based on free market, because they do granted, it's a countywide appraisal, but they are using appraisal principles and standards to arrive at those valuations. Is it 100% accurate? No, it's not 100% accurate.
All I'm saying is, when everybody feels anxiety that their property tax may go up because the county's valuation goes up, that listed valuation in recent years has not been anywhere close to what the for sale price is if somebody sells their Lakewood home. So there's a higher multiple when you go to a new seller compared to what the auditor is giving.
Yeah, I mean, if I could interject here, and I, in my day job, we buy 20, 30 properties a year. So typically, particularly with an institutional site like this that was non-taxed previously, right? I call it a WAG. a guess essentially as to what the county auditor has on there. And then, so I think that the benefit, to the chair's question, the benefit of expressing a land value now is to kind of candidly corner the developer into a tax value that will then benefit the schools and the rest of the community. So there's a large difference in what their property tax is going to be on the land between 1.5 million and 6 million. And that's a big difference between what everyone else in this room that owns property in Lakewood will pay on their tax bill as well. So that's why it's important, and that's why I'd suggest that we are thoughtful about it as we go through this process, because, while the TIF and the abatement is one thing, right, and that's the improvement, the land value is going to be very important here for the longevity of that site and for what it does to the tax burden for all of us in Lakewood. And I think, for the record, I think it's closer to 6 million, 1.5. That's just my own opinion, though. I'm not an appraiser.
And, Mr. Chair, if it's okay if I
Please.
go on conversational here. So the other thing I guess I'm contemplating, colleagues, I don't know, I'll direct my comments to the city council rather than the administration, is that we're here to vet the proposal to make sure it's on firm ground. We're here to potentially propose improvements like the ones we've been talking about, and hopefully to facilitate a negotiation. We don't know if some of these improvements, such as increased accessibility for a higher number of units, are going to be feasible. Part of the answer of whether it's feasible is what will the development partner agree to. And I don't know that without us getting into it. But if council is clear that that's a priority, then that gives the administration a stronger hand to negotiate. And so the same goes if we're clarifying what the public subsidy is of this proposed development is, then we're clear on how much value the taxpayer's kicking in, and you compare that to CASTA, which I understand has got 14 million in equity. They're contemplating 14 million in equity, but that's not as high as what the public so far is potentially putting in.
Mr. Chair? I don't want to interrupt your thought too much, if that's okay.
That's fine, yes.
Just a quick point. So just on this conversation, but there is a plan to get a new assessment, right? That's part of the plan, because we'd have to have that in order to do the TIF, right? Is that?
We don't necessarily need it to have to do the TIF. What we need to have it for is how are we going to value, and then how are we going to transfer this property? And what is the value of this property is going to be transferred at? And so part of that goes into the overall equation of the project. So right now, the numbers that you've been presented have an $18 million or so gap. We obviously have to go forth and figure out with detail what does that gap look like when it's all designed. That $18 million right now doesn't contemplate a land price. And so whatever that land price is that we decide to sell this for, it's just basically going onto the gap that has to then be closed through TIF and through other measures. So yes, it is something that has to be done, but because there's a lot of larger other issues that are kind of feeding into this overall puzzle, it's something that we'll consider as we get farther into this through a broker's opinion of value or an appraisal, whatever direction we decide to go, to define what that value is and then figure out how it fits into the puzzle. I know that was a point of discussion, a significant point of discussion with the last proposal, and deals like this, and as you saw in the comparison deals that we had brought forward from Cleveland Heights and Shaker, land is sometimes one of the subsidies that goes into projects like this. I'm not saying that's going to be the case here, but it's very possible, it's very likely that's going to be the case here. And it's something we just have to figure out as we get deeper into it. I appreciate, yes, we do need to we do need to understand what that value is. We've kind of pushed that down the road, knowing that there's a lot of other things we need to figure out along the way.
So to speak. Okay.
And can I ask a follow-up?
Please do, and then I do want to respect that Councilman Bullock has the floor.
And thank you, Councilman Bullock, for letting me ask these follow-ups. So do you have any sense of when that might happen? And then the other part of that question is, would that be after the site is brought? I know it's not coming fully to grade now, but the pit filled in, so to speak.
So, we would we could even do it before that happens, because we can provide the plans to the realtor, the broker, whoever, or the appraiser, whoever's going to do this. We'll also have to provide them information about the environmental restrictions that are on the site. So that's something that'll happen sooner than later, but it's, yes, before you see this back in front of you again, we will have that information figured out.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Councilman Bullock, for letting me follow this.
No problem. Thanks for the collegiality that you and the chair are affording all of us. So in terms of, I'm following the form that Councilwoman Keppel shared for council to organize its thoughts. So I'm going to skip to the third section, which is term sheet and open items. I do think council should be represented at the negotiating table along with the administration. In my mind, 2 council members. I think that is consistent with what came before. That's not excessive. We can be thoughtful about which members would participate, although I think highly of Mr. Baker, not to name names. I heard, is it clear, the city is a co-applicant with CASTA before ABR and Planning Commission? I think we should not be. Could I get a clarification on that?
We're the property owner, so in some respects, we're required to be.
Okay.
We aren't in any way,
Are we just listed on the paper, as it were?
yeah, we're listed on paper as, it's their proposal. There's of course, we certainly have ethical obligations as we go through a zoning application, even though the city is the property owner. We have to represent that application based on what is in the zoning code. But yes, our name will be on the paper as the property owner and therefore as a co-applicant.
That's the spirit of the question, and the point that a resident raised with me is that we want impartiality and a thorough job, with the space for the boards and commissions to do a thorough job without feeling as if the city is becoming an advocate.
We agree.
In that capacity, we should be an umpire for the board to do, those boards to do their job. So I appreciate that clarification.
We agree.
Okay, environmental status of the property. We've talked about this at various points throughout our hearings. I had thought that it was a settled deal or matter because we have the letter of no further action. I understand it's more complex than that. And maybe we don't need to get into the detail right this moment, but we should, I think, be clear what it is that the status is and the transfer of responsibility under different scenarios. When the property transfer happens, or if there are issues or events that arise during the negotiation that we're preparing for those contingencies.
So as far as the environmental encumbrances that are left with the property, yes, we have completed the OEPA has signed off on this. We have satisfied the remediation to the best that we possibly can in the eyes of the EPA. We have a no further action letter. We've completed the voluntary action program. We have a covenant not to sue on the property, which is an environmental covenant. Basically acknowledges that there are contaminants that still remain within the soil or within the groundwater and probably within the soils as well. And that there are certain restrictions that occur as a result of that. Those restrictions include, it's very different than radon, but it's not unlike radon. So these are gases. This is something that as they put buildings on the footprint of where the contamination is, there's a couple of different things that they have to do. They provide vapor barriers underneath their slabs, and they also have to provide ventilation to move gases up through and out the buildings. And generally that's a passive ventilation. Sometimes before they can, well, what happens then is before they can occupy the buildings, they have to do air quality tests inside them, send the results down to the EPA. The EPA has to sign off on it. Occasionally, That's not enough, and they have to then put in active fans to actively ventilate the air through the building. 99.9% of the time, maybe 100% of the time, that resolves the issue. But there is a risk to the developer that is because of the environmental conditions on the property. That's essentially what they do. That has a cost to it. In the scheme of things, it's still a significant cost. I believe the previous developer estimated at around $4 million. And so it's not an inexpensive venture to incorporate these items. And then they're also subject to annual monitoring every year until the restrictions eventually lifted by the EPA.
Thank you for that helpful review. I guess what I'm also asking, though, is that if there are complications since that have arisen, such as seepage, do we have confidence that the financial partners that are going to underwrite this potential deal are A, informed, and B, satisfied that conditions are sound for them to do their part, which is to finance a deal?
They are informed. In fact, part of one of the delays we had in getting back to this point is because the developer was working with their financial partners to make sure that they understood the conditions on the site and that they were comfortable with working with the underwriters. And so they have pre-vetted this with their financial partners. This is not an unusual condition. There are many dry cleaners in the state of Ohio where this condition exists. Not every lender will provide lending on a site like this, but the lenders that they're working with certainly do.
You've worked through these very questions, is what you're saying.
We have.
Okay, we appreciate that. It occurs to me, the money that council approved to grade this, to bring the site to grade may further resolve some of these questions that I've been focusing on the last few minutes. In other words, if it's capped, I mean, you've made this argument, Director Leonard, a number of times, that it's capped in various ways, and the level of the soil is such that it's above the groundwater, et cetera. If that improves it, and that improves the land management, parcel value, all of that, then perhaps we should do that and then consider the transfer and valuation after that point. But, for consideration, let's not necessarily talk about it right this moment, but I get the sense that these are a set of issues you have worked through and Mr. Story's worked through before, and I just want to feel the confidence of that. Thank you. Okay, now on to the substance. The things that I wanted to advocate for, these are improvements, potential improvements to the project, and you've heard me talk about them all, so these should not be really new surprises. But I'd like to officially, state these to my colleagues for consideration in a council document or statement of some kind. I'm just going to kind of proceed quickly through them. Preserve to the maximum extent possible historic preservation of the Curtis Block and further improve upon the most recent rendering that we saw this past Monday, April 25, which was an improvement. And I, had some ideas for how we might further improve that. I understand very clearly that there's a big financial number that's involved in resolving that difference. But my opinion is that we should support exploring our options, including potentially finding new resources to make that a feasible outcome. This is an example, by the way, of a question that I don't think ABR Planning Commission can help us with. Because if we're talking about finding funds to make this thing possible, that's outside their jurisdiction. So that's one major potential issue.
May I comment there, Councilman?
Yeah.
The Curtis Block.
Do we want to go through everything one by one, or do we want to just, I guess we could, but I'm aware that, so for some of these, I think council needs to do a little bit more work before we know what we think, as it were. Is that fair to say?
Well, my comment on that related to historic preservation and the Curtis Block building is that we have our developer thanks to, I believe, a question from Councilman Baker at our most recent meeting, who has stated clearly that a full preservation of that building would probably equal their bowing out of the project. And I think that is a very real answer that we as a council, as an administration, et cetera, need to grapple with, perhaps sooner rather than later, because this is a long road to go down and not fully understand the facts around that. My point in saying that is that I'm amenable to the idea of a facade save if that's possible, so that we can keep on the trajectory that we're on. I've also, like many of my colleagues, had the opportunity to tour the building and see where it's at currently, and I think sort of understand where we're at with that building and how it impacts this site and how it impacts the full development going forward. And so, from a council priority perspective and how we want to put ourselves forward on this, I think it's actually pretty important sooner rather than later that we decide what our thoughts are here. And from, again, my perspective, I would support a facade save at this stage.
I made the mistake of reading left to right on my page. Could I start with the easier ones first?
I'd also like to clarify I believe what I was asking is if we took the Curtis Block out of their development.
Sure.
So the question wasn't asked if we said, do a complete historic reservation, would you still be interested? I believe, and he said, we wouldn't be interested if it was out of the project. So there could be a public.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point, and perhaps there's other resources available. But I did take it to mean perhaps that if a full save of that building was contemplated, they would also be similarly disinterested in the project.
Yeah, I guess I didn't ask the follow-up.
I didn't hear them say that. I heard them say they're concerned about site control and about cost.
We'll have to go to the videotape.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, we've had these discussions, obviously, and if there would be a removal of the Curtis Block from their proposal, they would leave.
I heard them say that. I agree. So that's not what I'm proposing here.
Full save is the same.
But is it?
Or removing it from the development proposal itself.
Yeah,
If it's not part of the site, then will not be here.
But what if it's a
Is the
full
answer-
save? Is
right.
the
Same
same
response.
answer?
Same answer.
Pardon me?
Is it the same answer if it's a full save?
Correct.
Yes, same
So,
answer.
so, all right, John, this is kind of why I wanted to postpone this, because,
We're here.
okay. I think can we push the Curtis Block back until after a couple things that I think are easier and more consensus items? Let me just work on these other things. So the residential density is something I support. Councilman Schachner's already mentioned that. I'd love to see it added to the middle of the site. That involves additional cost. I don't know where the cost comes from, but I think we should explore it to see if it's feasible. The additional parking could potentially come if we could find a new home for 75 spots. So that's the next point, is we should explore whether we can get the clinic's needs met at another location, such as behind the Panera in a garage that's as close or a little bit closer than the one contemplated. I understand the clinic's not required to consider that. I think they might, though, if we approach them correctly. I think they might explore it. And when we negotiated that originally, the two parties that were in negotiations resolved a legitimate parking need. At the time, we didn't try to involve a third party, such as, a garage owned by a third party. But if there's a way to get that need met, that could open up some room to do some interesting things. So that's closely related in my mind. We should, and frankly, I think we should explore the 75 spots in a new location regardless, because it could reduce the cost. It could open up more space for other things. It could maybe shrink the footprint of that project. Another thing I support is what Councilman Baker has explored in his comments at previous meetings, which is to allow, and I think you said, Mr. Chair, allow for the potential for future growth if the market improves. So you prepare the buildings, the parking garage structurally to allow for a building to be built above it. I support that as well. We're exploring that, let's say. The parking garage screening is currently less than I was hoping for. I think other communities and the previous developer had a rendering that screened the parking garage entirely. I know we do envision landscaping, but I think we should try to protect it with better than landscaping.
Councilman, point of clarification there, if I may, on the parking garage. Is it facing the Family Health Center wholly?
Yeah, it's facing the Family Health Center, the parking lot, and then also the city-owned, a portion of the city-owned Community Health Center. Thank you. It also hasn't been designed yet. They're just showing some graphic representation of a landscape.
I guess my point is it's not facing any residences directly as currently
Correct.
set up. Thank you.
Well, I still would like it screened. It's an awfully big parking lot, or parking garage, and the developer is opting for that to save construction costs, which is an understandable thing to do, but that means there's more surface area for the rest of us to look at. And I think there's plenty of parking garages that are being built where there is better screening. So if we can pursue that, I think we should. You know, that's another cost item, but it's worth our consideration.
No worries.
Chief Story.
Mr. Chair and Councilman Bullock, I will endeavor to reach out to the Cleveland Clinic and begin the process on those 75 spots.
Thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, that's not something we can require, of course, but it might be good for multiple reasons. For example, if the parking garage I'm envisioning were to become viable, that would require another party to agree to that. It might be beneficial to them too, you know, in a number of different ways.
And only to put a nuanced point on this, and I'm not, necessarily advocating for, as many parking spots as we can get, but we might want to consider that the need to have 75 additional spots could be ultimately a good thing for the flow within this, within the development.
That's true too, yeah, for a bunch of different reasons, right. I mean, I 100% agree. So, because we heard from Roundstone about, their ratios and the residential about their ratios. But if we could, or if we could just reduce the price, because parking garage right now is proposed to be entirely subsidized by the public side, right? So if we save 75, it's around $2 million. We didn't need those spots, the community space that we talked a bunch about this, and I'm optimistic we're on a good path. But the question is just going to be, do we have a sufficient budget to achieve our highest vision for what the design is? Do we know the price of, or the size of the budget right now for the public space?
What's that? I don't
We discussed that last meeting.
remember what the number was off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think
It's-
we discussed that last meeting.
Yeah, it's rolled into the overall site cost. It's well into the seven figures, but I don't have the exact number.
Do we know the price for the different scale of finishes? In other
No.
words, is it enough?
No, we don't know that yet. They right now, we're talking about square foot cost, where they take a square foot, they apply a high-quality finish to it at a cost per square foot to arrive at a conceptual number.
Yeah, I understand,
The
right,
conceptual
so-
number, though, includes high-quality finishes and standards that we have had conversations, that you have all had conversations with them along the way.
And I certainly agree for this element, the design of the plaza is something that we can successfully do with public input and with our experts over time. That is one part of the proposal that I can agree that we can work on that over time, as long as there's money for it, right? Because if there's no budget, we're talking about concrete or grass. So I know that's not the goal, but if we're going to be realistic about achieving our highest hopes, we do need to make sure. So I guess I propose to include that we have a ample budget in a council priority list.
Yeah, and to interject, not to, but it's both in initial installation and in properly funding upkeep and maintenance, right? And that's where, when I was on planning commission at least, you know, we tried to put conditions on the approval of the plan unit development that, you know, there be ample maintenance, even to the level of like keeping certain tree species in certain amounts of plants. So you can get really nuanced and detailed in that process. So, you know, and I know there's a planning commission member in the crowd here, and I hope he's listening, because that's some, and we should advocate for that at planning commission, because then that literally gets baked into their zoning, right? So they have to do it.
That's a great point. I appreciate that. So not only the finishes and the design we should require, and I anticipate that the planning director's already accounted for this public consultation. I believe I thought we had purchased some of the drawings from the previous developer. The good public work done with the previous developer could potentially inform this. I'm getting a head shake. And then finally, the public use needs to be detailed, including the terms, the amount of time available to the public, the pricing, the maintenance, the upkeep. Councilman Baker just mentioned. I know some of this was addressed. I didn't catch it at the last meeting fully, but I think that's worth our time too, to be very clear to understand who's the management entity, who's responsible, and then what are the terms. So for example, if, you know, the public can access it for the low price of very high rental fee, it's not really public. And I don't get the sense that that's what the developer envisions, but those are important details to spend some time with, some thoughtful time with. I mean, I even know, like, the city's rental fees for the Women's Club Pavilion, they're not out of sight, but they're out of budget for some community groups, you know? So that's worth our time to think, how many days of the year, at what prices? It's, you know, maybe there could be different rental prices for a community nonprofit versus, you know, a for-profit company from the region, you know, I don't know, but that's worth some careful thought. And then the maintenance and things like what happens when, who polices the site? If there's rowdy behavior, is that expected to come from Lakewood Police? Should it? You know, I don't know, but those are important. Those could be hidden costs. And I think there's some functions you don't necessarily want the police for, on others you do. And having a good you know, good fences make good neighbors in this case, and so this very sensitive, privately owned public plaza, we want to set up for success by having thoughtful detail there. That's there. And maybe on the Curtis Block we postponed for a little bit, because I don't know if other colleagues have gone. I have more thoughts on Curtis Block, but I know that's going to take a while.
Well, no better time than the present, but do my colleagues have any other comments?
Well, I just want to mention one thing while Jesse's still here. Thanks again for your public comment. But, you know, when I go home, if anybody's seen this show Severance on Apple TV, like once I go home, my mind kind of switches over and all of a sudden I become a resident, lives across from this property. And I think a lot when I go home about the traffic and things. And I remember the process, and I'll be showing up. I think I may have to miss a meeting on the 17th of the boards, but I'll be showing up at Planning Commission and very interested in how these, and I think it'll really be dictated by why the street ends up being, and where the, you know, once we do the traffic study, where the entrances and exits are. I think that'll make a huge difference. And you're a neighbor. You're like literally right there, like a couple doors down, right, from this project. So it makes a big difference and impact in your life as to what happens, as I do. I'm only, 300, 400 yards the other direction. So I'll be keeping a close eye on that. I think that's where most of the action is going to happen. So thank you for that comment. I just wanted to make that note. Thank you.
Let's talk Curtis Block then, huh? I'd love to hear from my colleagues their thoughts on.
I have lots of comments, but I'll defer them until after we talk about this.
I was going to propose the other way around, but
Where?
but okay. So I'll go on. I'll put my suggestions out there in the Curtis Block. I guess there's two phases. One would be to state that it's a priority, if indeed that's what City Council thinks. Two is to explore how we could achieve that priority and to what degree. I, by the way, do respect the feedback we've been getting from the community. It's numerous, it's thoughtful, it's informed. And it's people that I've worked with for a decade or more on this issue. I believe that that Casto could be worked with if the conditions were correct. I think there is a way to please both sides, the historic preservation community and Casto. I heard space for that. The difference is the cost of it. And if we could find the cost, I think we could have both parties successful. They want flexibility so that their commercial tenant can function like it should, and they want site control, and I think those are reasonable things. But their first and second plan renderings for the whole site showed, one of them showed more retention of the building, and second showed full retention of Curtis Block. It also showed a lot more density and a bunch of things that aren't in the current iteration. So I understand that balance is changed in the plan. But if we play, further develop this concept, we'd be not far off from what the historic preservation community and our neighbors, I mean, it's not a group, it's us, it's the community, is hoping and asking for here. And I think there's a way to also meet Casto's business operation needs if we can figure it out.
So I appreciate the notion of if we could figure it out. Do you have a suggestion on how we figure that out?
I do, but it would be explore a couple possibilities to expand the financial pie. But I don't know that we do that right this moment. And, without a little bit more consensus development and with double check, I do hear and respect what the mayor and the planning director is saying is they're hearing that their partner has a red line and this is one of them, they don't want to cross that line. I want to double check exactly what the situation is. But we, it's possible that we could, and we don't spend a lot of time and effort exploring that unless we develop a little consensus.
Right. I rather than delaying it, if we feel like there's a compelling financial means to get our developer to change their current trajectory, we ought to get there rather quickly.
I mean, I think that's part of the negotiation, right? And so a number of the things we've been talking about tonight, sustainability, accessibility, more residential density, those all cost money. Where's that money going to come from? It's part of the negotiation. But they're also asking the city to subsidize the project to a very significant degree. And so that counts too, right? And so the question is, what is council willing to agree to for the price that's asked for? And that's why we're having this conversation tonight.
Certainly, and I guess I'll say I'll put my cards on the table just enough to say that a full preservation isn't something I require as a council priority moving forward. Just understanding where our developer is at, understanding that in large part the preservation of that building was to preserve that street corner, the corners, and this rendering, from my perspective, does precisely that.
Yeah. So what I'm suggesting that council would do is support exploration of options here. So we talked about specificity and granularity of how much or not. In this case, it would be, can we hang in there on the Curtis Block and find a solution that we haven't thought of so far? That's essentially my proposal. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's a lot of ifs in there. I also think Sean, if you go back to the previous slide you were on, I think there's with the cost. Okay, I think there's a line between facade preservation and full preservation that isn't listed here, and also the cost for the full preservation. We've gotten feedback that that's it's 7 million is high. And I know also CASA's not just concerned about the cost of that. They want their revenue to perform like they need it to, and that's a legitimate point that I respect. It's possible that they could achieve that success elsewhere on the site. We've been exploring density to the south, et cetera, right? So I've heard loud and clear what their answers are to date, but our job is, one of our options before us is to explore outside the box thinking or expand the parameters of the box, right? I appreciate the fact that the administration has proposed a lean proposal. You're trying to be financially responsible too, and I get that and appreciate that. So I think it's appropriate that this would be the moment as opposed to at the beginning of the process when we consider a modification like this.
Councilman, a couple quick comments, if that's okay, and then Councilmember Keppel has a few as well. One is I too, perhaps on some level, question the accuracy of the hard cost of the full preservation being $7 million. I could make the leap to say that if it were $5 million, if they're off by $2 million, it's still probably untenable, at least from my perspective. Second, I'd really like to know what the in-between facade preservation and full preservation is, if, to the extent you're talking about it here tonight. And then third, I could see there being a council priority to simply put that we want the Curtis Block building to be preserved to the greatest extent possible through the development as a priority, as a full council, realizing that getting 6 or 7 of us to buy into an exact destination for that building to be perhaps difficult. And that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, that's more or less what I'm asking for, is to the maximum extent possible. But I mean that the maximum extent possible means true exploration of other options beyond just in fine print, it's a facade save and that's nothing else. Because I do think there are options that, to answer your question, Mr. Chair, the full preservation may preclude modifications to the interior and does preclude modifications to the western facing that interfaces with the plaza. And I think that there can be flexibility on those points, which then allows CASA to activate the square and to let their first floor commercial tenant to function like they need to. Possible also the interior of the second story, but you'd have more preservation of the building, the exterior, and it could abut and interact. I talked about it at the last meeting. Now, for sure, there's more cost in that than demolition. Facade preservation, by the way, is no cakewalk. It can be engineering. It can be tricky in terms of engineering, and it could be the cost for that can go up, which I think is what we found in Garfield. Not Garfield School, but one of the schools. Was it Garfield? No, there's another school as well, Emerson. But at any rate, I think it's worth our time.
Thank you. Councilmember Keppel.
Unless, Madam Mayor, you were wanting to say something, or?
No,
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to thank you, Council, and just provide just a little bit of context to that $7 million figure. If you remember, the city has recent experience in adapting a historic building, namely Cove Church, which we all know was in much better condition than the Curtis Block. As a reminder, that building was also built before a lot of the inflationary issues we're facing, along with the shipping delays, and the cost of that was $5.1 million. So I just want to remind everyone for clarity, that's where we're at, in a much better building. We didn't have the structure issues that the Curtis Block has, and it was done, before some of the issues that we're facing with inflation and delays. So just providing that as some context.
Thank you. Councilmember Keppel, you have been very patient.
Thank you. Okay, so I was trying to capture this conversation into an actual priority language. And so I would suggest, if we were to say to restore the Curtis building to the greatest extent possible, prioritizing the 4-corner streetcar facade, and paying homage to the original building in the general design.
I could support that, certainly.
Yeah, I have a couple questions of the administration first, because, I think the Curtis block is important. I did hear, and I was on the planning commission, I know Norm more about it than I want to, from, just the historic documents are really interesting. It's kind of neat anytime you get a historic preservation, or a historic designation to planning commission. A couple things, though. One, I heard a little bit of kind of warming to the new plan from folks in the preservation community, although I think there are some that it's full preservation or not. The question I have for the administration, and I think the numbers, I think they're high, right, the 7 million, and I appreciate the mayor's point about, there's some differences between the building, but the point's well taken, that costs are rising. I do think in my eyes, it made me lose a little credibility for Casto when they put out that big number, because it's like, this is why, right, when in reality you can just confront some of the more, I think, well-reasoned points about the Curtis Block building. They want it to interface with the square, they want a more open retail space. They want to be confined by, the little slits that kind of are traditional storefronts. But question for the administration. Based on the historic designation that Planning Commission did back in 2017 or 18, would the plan as proposed most recently require Planning Commission or some sort of action or not?
So yes, any type of modification to a locally designated historic building requires a certificate of appropriateness, not by the planning commission, by the architectural board of review, actually holds that authority. So yes, an action is required by them.
So ultimately, it would have to pass.
It would.
Okay. So that ultimately gives the preservation community another opportunity to argue their case. Yes. Okay. And I think, to the chair's point, right? I mean, speaking as one member of the 5 on Planning Commission that approved it as historically designated, to me, the uniqueness was the corner, right? It was the streetcar suburb. It was one of the last ones intact. Although I think delivery is going to be incredibly important here. And the problem with a full historic designation, and you heard Mr. Sika discuss it, is he discussed it as a hyphen, I believe, between the building and the development. You kind of got to let all 4 sides breathe if it's a full historic designation. And you couldn't do any engagement on the south or west edge of the building, which is, I think, what the developer most wants more than anything else. So, I understand where we're at here, and I think I would support the language as Councilperson Keppel provided. I mean, I may want to sit with it for a night or two and kind of consider it, but generally speaking, I think, I understand where Casto's coming from, even though I don't want it to be true. Yes.
Fair enough. Councilman Schachner.
Thank you. To crib something that former Mayor Mitch Landrieu from New Orleans said, it's just like there's good news and bad news in terms of preserving having the money to preserve the Curtis block and doing whatever we want with this development project. I mean, the good news is we have all the money in the world to do it. The bad news is it's in your pocket. So the thing is, the reality of the situation, we have limited resources and limited ways to accomplish something for the city. And what we're doing now, and I think we're doing a good process, is doing the best we can with what we got and what is possible. And I think it's important to be frank with the public here. I've listened to what Casto had to say. I've looked into the history of the Curtis block. I'm aware that an RFP was put out in 2016, and there was only, and much better economic conditions, and there was only one person interested in responding to it. When was the last time that there was a commercial tenant in that building?
Mr. Chair, I can answer it. It was many years ago because Lakewood Hospital Association owned it and refused to rent it to anybody. And that was the beginning of the challenge, was that the downtown merchants were arguing that it should be occupied, and for a decade or more. So you're talking a long time. And then since the city secured ownership, which, by the way, came with the agreement that the city would take upon itself responsibility for owning and maintaining the building, and we collectively could be doing a better job. And I'm not casting aspersions, by the way, to the present administration, because this story begins years ago. That's the answer. So it hasn't been a rented commercial space because the previous owner had been using it essentially to screen the physical plant of the hospital, which was located directly behind it, so that the neighbors wouldn't have to see that directly. But I don't know that this could be in better shape than it was, but given the ownership.
I believe the date was the year is 2009. Is the last time a full-time tenant was in there. They've had some temporary uses that have taken place during the holidays and other events, but.
And I mean, if the CASO is saying, like, through their experience, that they can't market it, like, to a commercial tenant, they can't market it. And, you know, maybe that has to do with the skill, maybe that has to do with the comfort level, maybe that has to do with the present market. But if that's what they're saying, I mean, I tend to.
If I may add to
Yeah,
that,
sure.
Councilman, just quickly, my sense is not just that they can't market it, but that the Legos don't all fit together the way they'd like them to, if not for the ability to come right up to and utilize aspects of that building.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just to add color to that as well, if we think about the very historic buildings on Warren, the old Board of Education buildings have been owned by Liberty for a number of years. I had multiple conversations with them. They're struggling to just find a tenant in the old buildings. Now, luckily, we have, they purchased them, it's not in the city, but I'm just adding some color to the conversation. The reality is they're struggling to find a tenant.
And I appreciate Ms. Keppel's wording of that, paying homage and honoring it, because, I mean, I guess you can have different views of historical preservation. I guess that's almost what we're debating here tonight, is, are you preserving something exactly as it was, as a time capsule, to say, like the old stone house, physically lifting it up and putting it in the park and being like, this is what it looked like and this is what it is? Or are you kind of reminding people of what Lakewood looked like in the past, and it has those elements, and it still has that corner is somewhat intact with this facade, in a sense that it looks close to what it was. It still has similar elements. I'm sure they're going to preserve certain pieces of it, of the construction, that's salvageable within that save, and make something new out of it that's for a new generation of Lakewoodites and people that are going to be living here, and this is going to be their new normal. As we know, the interesting thing about this city is that we're about 50% renters. We have people that come in and out. People say that Lakewood is almost like the Ellis Island of Northeast Ohio, that you go around talking to people, they all say, oh, I lived in Lakewood in this time or here. I mean, Tom Hanks spent some time here. And I think it accomplishes the goal of reminding people where Lakewood came from, but it also shows where Lakewood's going. And it's that melding of the new and old together, which really is what is unique about this city. We have houses built in, like on Rosewood or Orchard Grove, one of those two, you have the original house for the orchard that's on that street. That's still there, surrounded by houses that have been flipped or rehabbed or built in the 50s even. you have houses built in the 1920s next to houses built in the 1940s. The city's a mix. It's not a monolith of houses built pre-19th century and post-19th century. You can see the history of the city as you travel north, because people didn't want to live, ironically, closer to the lake because it was too windy. So you have those newer houses there, and you see how things developed over time, when streetcars went out of favor, and then you had different needs and things like that. So frankly, I think if we're being completely honest about this, in my mind, and from the knowledge that I have and what I know and what I've heard, is I don't think truly the full preservation is on the table for this project. I just don't see how it pencils out. I don't see how you can do that and have the units to increase the density, because, I mean, that's sometimes, you know, like with compromises, it's not, the best compromises aren't everybody gets a little bit of what they want. That means nobody's happy. Sometimes a compromise means you get something and you lose something, or you get part of something, but you still get the best. It's about reaching the best possible result while honoring everybody's views and opinions and respecting those. And I think that's what we're doing. We're listening, we're considering them, but we're also trying to take into account the reality of this process. I don't know if that moved the needle anywhere in terms of what we're going to put in paper, but I just think it was important to get that out there.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Rader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, echo a lot of those points. Ms. Keppel, did you write that down? Could you reread that? I just want to comment on it directly, maybe.
And again, you know, this is
Oh, yeah,
the
this is
first
great.
tab, so we can wordsmith, but preserve the Curtis Building to the greatest extent possible, prioritizing the four-corner street car facade and paying homage to the original building throughout the design.
So I really like the homage is a word I immediately feel like it's a little too loose personally, but I think that the original design part is really important. I totally agree with Mr. Schachtner too. This is all about remembering our past and doing our best, but we also, I think, need to remember the specific structure. I think I'm trying to do justice to some of the folks that spoke about it, and it's specific history that whatever comes of this, it does look as if it were new. I think we can build that capacity somehow into this, even if it has to be integrated and has to be changed and added to the structure and made functional to 21st century or whatever, including efficiency standards, by the way, if possible, and accessibility, right? All important, but I just want to make sure that this building does have specific significance, and that whatever happens to it, it should really not just look like some old building from 1900, but look like the original Curtis block, right? Maybe there's some way too we can memorialize some of that history in it, of what it used to be and who was its former owner or something like that. So just want to throw that out there. And so I don't know if that changes the statement at all, or because I actually like it the way you said the original. Pay homage to the original, structure itself. I actually like it. So I thought I might have a problem, but I don't think I do.
Councilman, thank you for those comments. I given that and sort of where we're at in the time and things of that sort, I'm thinking maybe 8:45 or so if people are amenable to that.
In my comments, Mr. Chair, at some
Before you-
point, but I want to make sure we
Absolutely.
close the loop on the Curtis block. I have a
Absolutely,
couple other
absolutely.
comments.
But just as a housekeeping piece here, I think we could have something drafted from a priority standpoint in anticipation of our Monday meeting, have that referred perhaps to committee of the whole, and then discussed at the next, before our next or in between the second meeting of May, and then for some final approval by that second May meeting, so that Planning Commission, other boards and commissions, and the public, as well as the developer and the administration, are all aware of council's priorities going forward. But yes, I do want to make sure we get to everybody's Curtis Block comments.
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to work with Councilwoman Keppel and/or Mr. Baker and whomever on the wordsmithing. I think we're close. we can get there in terms of what it should say, which would just reserve that place to explore further. And I hear my colleagues, there's a range of opinions about how much weight we assign here. I do hope that we don't assign low or insignificant weight to historic preservation, because I think I'm hearing people say, well, if it's the development or this, then this goes. Let's not think in zero-sum terms. Let's see if we can get it all to fit. And I don't think we've exhausted all options how we can do that. So I'll be happy to work with my colleagues on crafting that artfully and thoughtfully. And then the tough part's going to be exploring what the alternatives are to actually make that financially work. But that goes, and by the way, that goes for some of their other priorities. Residential, how are we going to add residential density? What we're told by the developers, they can't change anything, because if they add anything on the south of the site, I did hear that, but that's not necessarily on the scale of adding, you know, significant density so the pro forma performs better to the taxpayer's interest and to the shopping district vitality and more residents, et cetera. It would actually increase the percentage of affordable housing units, the percentage of accessible units if there were more units, right? What they're telling us right now is they can't change anything. I hope that's not literally true, or that we negotiate with them. They said they can't add another floor because it'll wreck their construction budget, because you'd have to go to different materials costs and everything. So I think what the process is that council decides what we want to indicate priority on, and try to equip the negotiation or the continued exploration that we can improve the quality in certain regards. Curtis Block is potentially one of them, and these other things are there too. Mr. Chair, I do think we need to have our document before a vote. So if you're suggesting, I think I heard you say that we might vote on the term sheet but not have council's list until a week or two later. I'd prefer not to do it that way. I think we should work hard to get our conditions correct, or whatever it is that council wants to say. Either get it done Monday or push the vote back.
Councilman, I appreciate that sentiment, and I do want to get to Mr. Baker's comments on the Curtis Block as well. I don't think that the administration nor the public requires City Council's docket in order to understand our priorities on this issue. So we have hours of meetings discussing this to have made our priorities known in many ways. So I don't think that 2-week gap is something that will make will hinder our ability to show our priorities in this, or somehow set the administration in their negotiations on a path that is in complete opposition to our priorities.
Let's talk some further, afterwards about it. But if we're having a vote that gives legal approval or symbolic approval, the time for City Council to attach our priorities is a part of that vote. That's my strong recommendation.
Understood.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councilman Baker.
Yeah, and I have comments beyond the Curtis Block, so I'd like to, and
You have your segue opportunity.
and no one has touched on it. I'm surprised, and it sounds like I'm the only one that's like fixated on this parking garage. But we talked a little bit about it at the last meeting. So I'd really like the administration to, because I think, and this dovetails into Councilman Bullock's statement about, if the developer's telling us certain things aren't going to work, then, if we can make a public case for it, right, then there is ways to bring extra funds to the project if they pay off, right? If there's a pay for in the end, and it can be shown up front. So with the parking deck, I mean, this goes into, if you look at the sheet that Councilman Rader sent around about sustainability, there was a whole section on the parking deck. A couple interesting notes in that section. One was, in Cincinnati, they literally converted a parking deck into a hotel. So that's interesting, right? You hear a lot of people talk about hotels, and that's what they'd like to see. Secondly, and I appreciate the Q&A that Director Leininger sent out. talked about how they'll be thoughtful in the design about being able to convert at some later point, right, if parking needs go down. So that's important, right, building it so that you just don't need to demo it, because the most sustainable building is an existing building. I would like to explore, and I feel like I'm like a broken record here, or, the ability to go up above it. I think the $3.5 million number that they quoted, I mean, I don't doubt that Donnelly's gave them that number. But I do, and for the record, it's about a quarter of the price of the garage, right? If the garage is about $13 million. So that's about 3.5. They did say that the short span steel could be less expensive, but it would maybe require a different kind of parking plan in the garage because you have more obstructions. Kind of what I heard from them, though, right? And this is where I think we may want to, as a city and an administration, ground source this and ground truth this a little more, is like, they don't want to deal with having someone above them in their parking garage, right? So it's the day-to-day. If the city did go vertical, then it messes with their parking scheme. There's utilities involved. Now, those are things I think that if you're thoughtful about how you retain the air rights, you can work out, right? Let's say if a redevelopment that goes north, that goes up in the sky above the garage takes 50 spots that during the term of construction the city will pay, right, or whatever, right, as they retain those rights. So I just think because we're existing right now in the market conditions that the mayor noted with, stretched supply chains, inflation, but we're making a land use decision that will stay when my kids are on this site, right? So I think to the extent we can be as thoughtful as possible with things that can pay off in the future, we should be thinking about them, and we should be ground sourcing them, because I heard a developer that just doesn't want someone to put something on top of their garage, when in reality, we as a city are going to be the ones that retain those rights to put something above that garage. So I just think it's something we should think about. And also because, they're not making more land in Lakewood. We always talk about that, right? So to the extent you have vertical rights, the better. So that's that, right, on the parking deck. So I would love, and I get the sense that, you guys don't love that decision, is that, or that line of thinking?
I think as the developer shared, it does put pressure on them. It does, the $3.5 million number is one number just to supersize the structure. But then as you put uses on top of that structure, now you're increasing the parking demand and the parking load that needs to be accounted for. So you may be now adding additional parking to accommodate additional uses on top of the garage. And so it's just another, certainly something that they discussed. Clearly they've explored it. They haven't said no, but it does give them some pause. So.
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, what I'm advocating is that potentially that there be a city investment in it to basically to keep the air rights, right? To keep their options open in the future. And I just think that, and I'll do some independent research on, I think Ms. Nichols was very clear that she hasn't seen it happen in Northeast Ohio, but sometimes Northeast Ohio isn't the leader on things, so we can look for other places to see what they're doing. And I'm not saying we should do it, I'm just saying we need to be as thoughtful as we possibly can about making sure we're making decisions today that, we don't hem in our kids, right, in their decisions later. Residential density was talked about. I think we should explore it, including what Mr. Bullock said about potentially if there's a pay for it, right? If more public money is needed, but then you can show the increased income taxes over a certain amount of years, and it would take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to pay for it. Let's have that discussion. I'm willing to do it. Commercial office density sounds like it's a no-go. I mean, but I heard an office user say, yeah, I thought I was going to need 3 floors. Now I definitely need 3. I thought I was going to need 2 and maybe 3, but now I definitely need 3. I say we push as hard as we can to try to get more. Now I understand that may play with Roundstone a little bit because right now they'd be 3/4 of the HOA, so they have more decision-making authority. If you add a floor, they're only 60% as opposed to 3/4, so that's something to think about. But that's income taxes for the city. That's bringing in people that don't live in the city. It's something I think we should think about. Tenant sourcing. So this is, and I know there's some discussion of it in the term sheet. I'd be interested in the administration pushing and getting a little more granular with it, granular with it. What I don't want to see is just a bunch of shuffling in Lakewood. And I don't think anyone wants to see that. So I think there is some terms we can put in there about, we want local, but only 25% or some percentage of your tenant source can come from existing Lakewood businesses, right? I don't know what that number is. I just threw out 25% as an example, but I think it's something we should think about. We don't want to rob all the other commercial property owners in Lakewood of their tenants. We want to bring new in, right, to expand the pie, not keep it the same size. Incentives, this is probably the most important discussion we're going to have here, right? And I think it's what's squarely in council's role. So, with that, I'd love to see, I've seen, some numbers that kind of add up that show their hard costs that show 90 million, that show 81 million, show a bunch of different things. They took out what Roundstone was going to have to pay for because it was kind of a, they were going to pay for all the costs. I'd like to see a one-sheet sources and uses, and if that's something that Casto is saying is trade secret, then we can go in executive session and look at it. But I just love to see that because I've seen a lot of, this is our square footage cost. Is that just hard cost? Is that hard cost and soft cost? So there's lots of different things that I think we should, I think it's incumbent upon us, and it's our fiduciary duty as council members to really push back and understand whether those are sourced or not, right? I mean, so normally when the city goes out for construction, you get bids, right? You competitively price things. This is a developer that has a relationship with their builder, right? And their builder is going to give them the price that they're going to give them, but they're building a bunch of different stuff. So I think it's incumbent on us to try to ground source some of that stuff because there aren't the public contract delivery processes that the city has to follow. They're not necessarily following. So I think we should be as tough as we can be on those things. But collaborative, right? They're our partner, but we trust but verify. So that's where when the incentives come, I mean, I think Director Leininger has done a good job of kind of teeing up where we're going, but obviously we're going to need to get down in the details on this because it's probably the most important part of the project that council's going to have is the incentives. And to Councilman Bullock's point, right, I mean, 18 million of a $90 million project, we're effectively a 20% equity stake in this, right? So not only do we own the land, but right, we're the 20% equity stake. So we should throw ourselves around a little bit and have our opinions known, understanding that Casto's a developer and they need to make money, right? So high level, those are some of the things I thought were important to cover. Just wanted to get out there more of a soliloquy. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. Thank you, Councilman Rader. Councilman Bullock.
Thank you. Maybe I just kind of wrote down some notes, and I think this is really important, and I totally agree with Councilmember Baker that the garage, and maybe this is something we can at least throw in our draft to work on. The garage should, tell me if this is enough, the parking garage should be designed and built to be easily adapted and potentially expanded vertically for future use. A good starting sentence to put in our document. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just want Mr. Baker to not feel like he's alone on an island. I mentioned and supported in my previous narrative the future expansion above the garage as a concept, and all the other items you mentioned were good and sound ones as well. So count me as a supporter of those. Thanks.
John, real quick. Councilman Scheck.
Including office density, if that's possible.
I especially echo Mr. Baker's point about if something is worth the money, then we should be considering it and doing that due diligence to see like, hey, that garage, if it's going to cost a little more, but it's worth the city putting the money into it, then fine. That's a decision for us to make. Same thing with residential density. Building up is going to cost a little more because of materials, and the city has to kick in a little more to make that possible. We got to see if that pencils out and makes it worth it for us and our residents. So I hope I restated those properly, but I agree with those sentiments.
And I just want to circle back to Curtis Block to say that I hear a lot of us talking about density being important. My sense is that preserving the Curtis Block building and keeping it separate from the rest of the development only negatively impacts the density of the project. Okay. Any other high-level?
Can I hear? I'm sorry, I was distracted, Mr. Chair. You're saying the Curtis Block would negatively impact the density?
Curtis Block being separately preserved could negatively impact the density of the overall project.
I respect where you're coming from. I think that's possible to solve that. You'd move the density from where it is to somewhere else, or at least part of it. They've already done some of that. And there's a solution there, I think. Thanks.
Comments from the administration further? Colleagues?
I just want to summarize our plan moving forward.
Sure.
Is, I've made a bunch of notes. If anybody else has made notes about what we heard as priorities today, and then my understanding is Councilman Baker and I will draft a document with those priorities, and we will review that. We're introducing that onto the docket at our regular meeting on Monday.
We anticipated that we would have something for Monday, so there's a placeholder.
Okay.
Agenda item for that.
We're not having a cow on Monday?
I was not planning one.
We could have a quick cow just to introduce it. I mean,
Yeah, we could do a cow, introduce what we have so far, get a little feedback.
I'm amenable to that.
yeah, so, Councilperson Keppel, I think what we could do is, expeditiously as possible, you and I draft, and then not have the rest of council deliberate on it on email, but at least send it out to them so that they can
Yes.
come on Monday with their comments.
Correct. That's what would be my expectation.
And then, yeah, and I have a family vacation the second Monday of May, and I'd like to stay in my family, so I'm going.
I think that's wise.
And Mr. Chair, we could always call a special meeting of the council if it was needed, but, does it matter to the administration if we're, you were proposing that council wait 2 weeks? I'm not proposing that, but if we needed more time, we could find ways to move with all due speed while being deliberative and thorough. I mean, that's the sweet spot, so respecting vacations and all the rest.
Sure. Well, let's definitely plan on a committee of the whole meeting next Monday. I don't think there's anything else scheduled, Nick, but I don't know if you know. Okay. Not looking to have another marathon session. You're welcome. But we will have some kind of a committee of the whole meeting next Monday and perhaps get somewhere on this, perhaps be able to button it up.
Yeah, and one last clarification, so we talked about the potential for having a council person or two, I guess like kind of being the appointed people to work with the administration and Casto. Curious as to, we can express that as a desire in the communication if everyone's comfortable with that, or if not, we should talk about it. Right?
Sure, and I think I'd like to first understand how the mechanics of that could and would work before we put ourselves out there as how we want to do that. So we ought to figure that out in short order. Where our seat at the table is, so to speak. And with that, I think I appreciate everybody's lengthy deliberations on all this. I think we've accomplished a lot, had some difficult conversations, but everybody's been very friendly and helpful to each other and excellent listeners. And I really appreciate everybody's time. I think our goal here ultimately is to make the best 50 to 100-year decision on a historic piece of property in our city. That isn't easy, and there's trade-offs and all those sorts of things. We all want the highest and best use for the site, I think, but highest and best use has to take into account the citizens or the residents of our city, has to take into account us, of course, as two different bodies of our government. Does have to take into account the developer, certainly the retail and tenants of the site. I do have faith in our boards and commissions, our ABR and Planning Commission, to have a deliberative process on all of this. I just have a huge, strong desire to fill a gaping hole in Ward 3 and Lakewood, so none of us have to stare at it ever again, and we can have something that we can all be proud of as a city. We'll continue to do our due diligence. I think we'll do our best to retain what I feel is a good and decent developer and a good and decent anchor tenant in the office space. And we'll do our best to also retain the surrounding residents of this space, because it's all for naught if we're scaring off people who've established themselves in Lakewood for a long period of time. And I'm talking to my Marlowe residents in the room as well as anybody else watching online. So again, I thank everybody for a good party process. And with that, being no further business on our agenda,
I'd just like to thank the chair for bringing pizza.
oh, you're welcome. Take cold pizza home. All right, we're adjourned.
Thank you.